In the previous episode, Mahesh Vyas of CMIE lined out the landscape for unemployment in India and how things have decelerated from bad to worse in the last few quarters.
How is it that a person who is unemployed for 6.5 days and employed only for half a day in that 7-day period still called employed?
In this episode, hear him detail the alarmingly high levels of unemployment amongst the youth and why the lack of jobs is not going to get corrected in a hurry. I did read another study, Mahesh, that indicated that the highest rates of unemployment actually exist within those with the highest levels of education. Is that something you would corroborate?
That is true. So, graduates face larger unemployment rates because if you are much less educated, very likely you are much less privileged and therefore you would take up any job. So, you would probably, without meaning to demean any labor, you would be willing to push a cart and hawk fruit or some such thing, or do anything to put two ends together. If you are a graduate, you would refrain from doing that, A. B, you could afford to remain unemployed till you got an appropriate job. There are studies which say that people remain unemployed till the age of 30 because they can afford to remain unemployed till the age of 30 till they get a job in a government organization. After 30 you are over age, or 32 if you are SC, ST, etc. And once you cross that critical age, then you take up any job in the private sector. So, you will see graduates remaining unemployed till age 30. You will see people who have not even completed their matriculate becoming employed even at the age of 20. So, education and being a little privileged holds you from joining the labor force faster. You keep saying I am studying. You know, even at age 28, you say I am studying in a competitive exam to get a job in the government.
And jump right into the labor force.
That's right.
In your experience, have you ever seen a period like this go through for the Indian economy or for the Indian labor force, where there are so many people who have gotten to this point in terms of their education, a graduation or a post graduation, and it's such a large bulge of unemployed people?
Well, the numbers today obviously are much bigger than any time in the past. But I think in the 70s we did have stress on the labor front as well. So, the 70s did have big unemployment problems. See, these are waves. So, there was a wave of graduates that came out in the 70s and the jobs that they were looking for, aspiring for, were not there. So, we did see that problem for some time, and in some time in the 80s, particularly in the mid 80s, the economy did accelerate and absorbed a lot of these people, and the problem kind of went down a bit, and we have come back to this problem after 1970s. We have come to it in 2015, 2016 type.
And we're also staring at a situation, Mahesh, where, I mean, by any forms of data, the next 2-4 quarters are going to continue to be difficult for us economy wise, which means that we're probably living with these unemployment figures for a much more protracted period.
It does look like that. I don't make a projection of what the future will look like on this front. I don't make projections about this, but I don't see anything solving this problem. You know, I don't see any action by the private sector because there are no incentive for them to do that, and there is no action from the government to splurge money in a direction that leads to employment. So, if for example, there is a scheme like Manrega which is directed towards employment generation, then I would say, okay, there is a solution coming up somewhere, then we would all complain about the inefficiency of such an action. But at least it would give us some headway. Currently, we don't even have an inefficient solution towards solving the unemployment problem.
And if you're saying we're taking at a 10% rate overall in terms of unemployment, what would you say that figure would be for the youth at this point, for youth unemployment?
Youth meaning in their 20s?
The 15 to 32, which is where you usually start grouping them.
That's easily around 25% or so.
25% unemployment for the youth.
between 20 and 25%, easily touching 25% at the lower end of the spectrum, but 20 to 25% is what they face.
Walk me through what's happening there.
Well, it's the same thing that I said, that people wait to get an appropriate job when you become a graduate. So they don't accept jobs which are not commensurate with their education, and they can afford to remain unemployed. So it's not that they're going to not be able to make payments to put together a living. So in the West, typically what happens is that you reach 18 years of age and you're ready, it's expected that you're leaving your home. And then you have to worry about your rent and about your food bills. Yeah. Here you don't have to worry about your rent and you don't have to worry about your food bills because you live off your parents, even till age 30. So you can afford, and that's an important thing, you can afford to remain unemployed even till age 30, and it's not even a social taboo.
I want to draw your attention to a report that was recently released from the Azim Premji University that also talked about this unemployment figure, and 2 points there. One, the point that this had never been seen in the history of India, this kind of job loss, and 2, an interesting term which they used, which is the number of open unemployed and disheartened labor force. I don't know if that's being sentimental or there's actually an economic term to define a disheartened labor force, but tell me what you made of that. The fact that this is the first time in India's history that you're dealing with this situation in terms of joblessness, as also the disheartenment amongst people looking for jobs.
So this is the study done by Santosh Mehrotra and his colleague, and Santosh is an expert on the NSSO data releases. So he has now tortured and worked upon the PLFS data, as we all expected him to do, and has compared that with the past NSSO data, and his claim, made very strongly, is that the numbers are comparable. And he has come to a conclusion by analyzing that data that this is the first time in India's history that we have seen a shrinking of the employed. This more or less is in line with what we are finding, that employment did fall. And so the two numbers, and I have seen the NSSO basic numbers and the CMI numbers do tell the same story. So Santosh and a company have come to this conclusion. The story about disheartened people, well, that's some finding that they have got. I have not gone into that in great detail, but broadly his findings are that employment has shrunk, and I kind of agree with him.
How does this stack up statewise, Mahesh? As the minister pointed out, there's apparently a lack of skilled workers within northern India, but how have these unemployment figures broken up between states?
The unemployment in the poorer states is always going to be low, because people in those states cannot afford to remain unemployed. So they are not the privileged people. So the poorer you are, the lower your unemployment rate is going to be. So typically a Bihar will find a very low unemployment rate. In other states, like currently in Haryana and Delhi, the unemployment rate is very high. So if the urbanization level is high, typically you will find a higher unemployment rate in there. So,
and where are they bubbling at for Haryana and Delhi, for example?
So Haryana was close to 20% unemployment rate. Delhi is also around that. So these are very high unemployment rates. Kashmir, till we could measure it, was over 25%. That was a stress point, and we could measure that stress in Kashmir even before the abrogation of Article 370. So that state had big difficulty on the unemployment, and today it's the biggest source of our trouble in making estimations, because we can't estimate Kashmir's unemployment rate. But that is a different story. But you have had many states where these unemployment rates go up and come down sometimes. Tamil Nadu had seen an increase in unemployment rate quite sharply in the past 1 year or so. Other states like Gujarat or Maharashtra usually don't see big bumps in unemployment. There's a steady state over there. The unemployment rates are quite low. Uttar Pradesh also doesn't get very high increases in unemployment. It's a very large state, largely agrarian, doesn't have any major reason for people to be largely unemployed, because the Gangetic belt gives you employment as a farmer, as a farm laborer relatively easily. When you are in a state like Haryana, where you don't have those privileges in a large part of the state and is semi-urban to a large extent, Faridabad, Gurgaon, that's when you start seeing big unemployment rates. So currently it is Delhi and Haryana, and partly I would say even Tamil Nadu, where the unemployment rates are high.
Any experience that ties in over the last couple of months where you have seen concerted action in terms of some public spend by a state government that has had a marked improvement or effect on state unemployment figures?
To the contrary. So, a large part of states are giving handouts. So, when a state starts giving direct transfers to households, then it reduces the incentive for the household to seek employment. So, if for example, in some South Indian states, we have seen old age pensions being given out. The pensions available to government servants is quite high. This is also a transfer. These transfers hold back or enable those households not to seek employment. So, there hasn't been any initiative of the government that has spurred people to go and find employment. Their efforts in doing skilling is not working. Whereas, on the other hand, the transfers that the government does to ease the pain in households is actually working against employment. And therefore, I would say that any effort to give handouts should be weighed against its impact on labor participation rate. It does have an adverse impact.
Because if my basic needs are met, I'm okay with
That's
not
right.
going through the stress and strife of looking for work.
That's right. If you have a house, you don't have to pay rent, and then if you get some money that can pay the basic bills, then you don't have sufficient reason to work hard to get jobs, because jobs are hard to get. They're not even easy. So, if it is so hard to get, why go and break your head over it?
What are the lessons to be drawn from here, Mahesh? I mean, we've dug ourselves into a hole. How do we dig ourselves back out? The small and medium enterprises, like you said, were, I think, really a flourishing sort of bed of employment. Are you seeing any green shoots in terms of the fact that they're trying to come back to life post the demonetization dhakka, or you don't see that?
I think I'd take up the first part of your question, what are the lessons to learn? We have gone through this mess now. The MSMEs have been slaughtered. Should we be reviving them, or should we be trying to make an industrial sector of India which is full of large scale companies? Why recreate those MSMEs? They were inefficient users of capital and inefficient users of labor. We should not try to revive them. We should try and find out how we can replace those with a very large set of very large companies.
But what happens when the existing large companies are not doing anything in terms of employment, perhaps forcing many to get into non-contractual obligations?
So, that's what we should tackle. So, if we are tackling the MSME and trying to revive them, we will not look at what's wrong with the large companies who are not doing anything. So, if we can find out what can we do to make the large companies become larger and become more efficient users of capital and labor, that would be a better solution. So, we need to learn a lesson that MSMEs are vulnerable. Anything can happen tomorrow and they can again be in trouble. So, instead of recreating an inefficient sector which unfortunately died because of the GST demonetization impact, let's not go and recreate that inefficient sector again. Let's build something much bigger. Let it be done by public sector involvement, make those big Bharat heavy electricals once again, and let's motivate the Tatas and Birlas and Goenkas and Adanis and Ambanis to make very large companies that employ lots of people all over the country. That is what we should be doing, and not doing this MSME business.
Have you seen any trends to suggest that, Mahesh?
I don't think so.
Oh dear.
But why not hope for it? Why not speak about it? Why not have that as our aim, that we should be having large companies who are globally competitive rather than having those MSMEs who can't compete for nuts?
No, absolutely. And I know that you don't, you're not comfortable putting out guidances, but if you were to give me a sense of how protracted this period of pain is looking like, what would you say?
I don't know how long this will last, but I don't see any signs or any actions that can break this
Vicious
monotony,
cycle that
this
we've gotten.
what looks like a vicious cycle. Nothing seems to be there on the horizon that seems to break this. Therefore, I can say that this will just keep getting bad to us.
Let me swivel for a second as well on what's happening on the company's end of things, Mahesh, because you track that as well, the minutiae of how companies are reporting their numbers. And I think for a lot of people, especially who look at business on a very basic level, this conundrum is something they can't understand. There's a stock market that's hitting record highs. There's an economy that is seemingly sinking, and then there are unemployment figures which are really the worst we've ever dealt with. To plot those three together is, I think, where the mind boggles for a lot of people, saying, hey, which one is the right one?
So the stock markets have, I have usually understood the stock markets to be a kind of a predictor of what's
I
going
thought
to
you might
happen
say
to the
fickle.
economy. No, it does tell us these are people who put their money on the table, and when they say that we are valuing the companies higher today, then they know where they are putting their money, and I would believe that they are foretelling me of good times to come. So when the PEs run ahead, when the broking companies put out those fancy
Buy targets
buy
and
targets,
recommendations.
you're right. I say, okay, I'm not buying, but I understand that you guys are saying something good is going to happen. Okay, so I don't have to necessarily buy their buys, but I certainly do believe that on an aggregate, these guys are sensing something that needs to be taken cognition of. This is broadly not wrong, but they seem to be getting something wrong sometimes. Like there was this big expectation of some magic will happen after Mr. Modi becomes the Prime Minister. Not a bad thing, because they were seeing a lot of stagnation in the last part of UPA too, so there's good reason to be very optimistic. And the first couple of years of Mr. Modi's prime ministership, we did see investments go up, promises go up, actions actually by companies did go up a lot, and then it came crashing down. The stock market did not see that decline adequately.
Coming.
They were not as gung-ho as they were in 2014. They certainly tempered their expectations, but they did not correct it all the way. They still held that hope, and therefore I think they were erring, and that's perfectly fine for the stock market to do. What I think is important over here is to be able to distinguish between a very small segment, which is the corporate sector, which, mind you, benefits from GST. So they are the beneficiaries of many of those things, like Make in India. Make in India is protectionism. What the government of India is doing in many other ways is also protectionist. So if there is protectionism in the short run, the corporate sector does stand to gain. What they are beginning to see now, which is in 2018 and 19, is that demand is starting to decline. Otherwise, there was nothing wrong in the stock market's optimism. They were saying, I have invested enough from 26, 27, 6, 7 through 12, 13, and even a little ahead. I've invested enough that I can continue to be profitable for a long time to come. So the optimism was based on there's a free ride from here onwards. That's what the market saw. They didn't have to invest. So when I was saying, and when people are saying no investments is bad for the economy, they didn't care, and they had good reason not to care. Now that they are seeing the demand to be shaking up a bit, and we saw demand slowing down, that's when they started correcting themselves, that there is trouble. And that's when they were scratching their head to say, is there really a demand crunch? And that happened only in 18, 19, the first quarter, when they saw this decline happen. But then came the tax cuts and came the interest rate cut. So the stock markets don't have sufficient reason to be pessimistic. They have a reason to be optimistic, and still the economy is not doing well. So in the short run, those investors are going to do well. I don't see anything irrational in their actions. But at the same time, the economy is not going to do well also. The economy does not look as at itself quarter to quarter like companies do. The economy is a 5-year game and a more than 5-year game, a 7-year game. Over a 5-year to 7-year horizon, India is not looking very good. Over the next few quarters and even let us say a year, the corporate sector will still make good profits. It's a free ride for them. So I think you can explain this dichotomy.
It's just two ends of the river. They're looking
right.
at two different things.
They're looking at two different things, correct.
In the past also, there's always been, Mahesh, a ship that sort of pulled us through. There was telecom that really did a lot of heavy lifting with employment. Then came IT. The baton then passed on to retail. So there was always that one guy who stood up and said, hey, come on, I'll take this on.
That's right.
Do you see that in the next 1 or 2 years? You don't see
in the next 1 or
sector.
2 years, there's nothing. Many of these are shrinking. Telecom is shrinking. Telecom is under huge stress and it is shrinking. IT is shrinking. Retail is starting to shrink. It may start shrinking. So the next couple of years look kind of hard for the Indian economy. The corporate sector will still get away with good profits.
That's a hard and gloomy picture, but I think it's a very realistic picture, Mahesh, and I think it's something all of us should wake up to. I want to end this conversation with a slightly different question to you. You've been a watcher and believer of data and the story within that for many, many decades now. What have you made of this complete crisis of confidence that we are facing in data and figures in the last couple of months? The numbers don't look like the numbers. There is outshouting in terms of what the real numbers might be. And I think people are left, frankly, quite disillusioned with whether or not they're even getting the true picture of where things stand.
Let's put it like this. I think the worst is behind us.
That's the first optimistic note I heard from you in the whole conversation, Mahesh.
Yes, I think the worst is behind us. So we made a huge mess of statistics in India. We damaged our credibility. But I think these things do happen. In the long run, they will look like a small blip. And I think correction is underway. And I think we will have a much healthier statistical system. There are people who are putting their heads together to solve the problem. Let's wish them the best. And CMI will continue to contribute towards putting out useful data, sometimes as an alternate to the government data and sometimes as a complement to it. But I think the worst is behind us.
But you would say in the months ahead, there is a greater granularity and detail and believability in the figures that we will begin to see?
It will take time. The most difficult problem to solve in terms of transparency and granularity, etc., is the GDP number. Yeah. So I think that will be the last one to get fixed. And I'm not an authority and I'm not anywhere in the government, in any committee of any kind, but this is my sense being a watcher of these things. I think the government is trying to put its act together in so far as the surveys are concerned at least. So, and lots of efforts are being made to ensure that we do regain our old glory on the statistical system. Within that, I think the private sector will continue to play a good role, a positive role in producing good quality data. I think it's also important that the private sector becomes a lot more discerning. The private sector is not sufficiently discerning when it comes to official data. So if the GDP numbers are not good, why wait for an Arvind Subramanian to tell us that? Most of us were skeptical even before that. But we pounced upon the problem only when Arvind showed us a paper challenging these numbers. But if there is a less shocking, more continuous effort of keeping on improving the situation, keeping on arguing that this number does not make sense, that could be improved a little bit, we will be much better off. So the strong position, no, government India data is sacrosanct and no, it is all rubbish, doesn't help. If there is a better engagement wherein we can argue how can the agriculture number be X when we saw the kharif crop was not good? How can the industrial production numbers be so good when we are seeing the IIP tanking every month? And if the government can answer us those questions, I think we will be much better off than having the GDP is off by 2 percentage points. That doesn't help. I mean, that doesn't help on an ongoing basis. So it was good that Arvind Subramanian's paper shook up a little bit, but we should not have these polarized positions. It's good if they're engaging positions. We are an argumentative nation. It's good to be argumentative. It's good to engage rather than call critics as anti-national.
Because the only way forward is forward together.
That's right. You're right.
Thank you very much, Mahesh, for
Thank
this
you.
conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.